On the afternoon of October 18, 1977, a transaction occurred at Arlington Hardware and Supply, a family-owned store located on Wilson Boulevard in Arlington, Virginia, approximately 4 miles from the Pentagon and less than 20 minutes by car from the heart of Washington, D.C. The store occupied a single-story brick building that had been operating continuously since 1953, serving a steady customer base of homeowners, contractors, maintenance workers, and the occasional federal employee looking to fix a leaky faucet or hang shelves in a government-subsidized apartment. The interior was organized in the traditional manner of hardware stores of that era, with narrow aisles lined floor to ceiling with bins of screws, drawers of hinges, walls of tools hanging on pegboard, and shelves stacked with paint cans, electrical supplies, plumbing fixtures, and miscellaneous items that defied easy categorization. Behind the front counter, which ran along the left side of the store near the entrance, stood Michael Brennan, a 28-year-old clerk who had been working at Arlington Hardware for just over 3 years, ever since returning from a brief and unsuccessful attempt at college in upstate New York. Michael had developed, over those 3 years, an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the store's inventory and a particular skill for reading customers. He could tell within 30 seconds of someone walking through the door whether they knew what they needed or whether they would require guidance, whether they were starting a major project or making an emergency repair, whether they were professionals who would return regularly or homeowners who might not be back for months. It was a skill born not from any formal training but from thousands of interactions, from paying attention to body language and purchasing patterns and the questions people asked. On that particular afternoon, sometime around 2:15, a man walked into the store who immediately registered in Michael's awareness as unusual, though it would take several minutes before Michael could articulate exactly why. The man was in his late 40s, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with graying brown hair combed neatly back from his forehead and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic appearance. He wore a dark wool coat over a button-down shirt and slacks, the kind of outfit that suggested office work rather than manual labor, and he carried himself with a posture that Michael would later describe as formal, almost rigid, the bearing of someone accustomed to moving through the world with purpose and precision. What struck Michael first was not the man's appearance but his behavior once inside the store. Most customers, even those with specific shopping lists, would pause near the entrance, orient themselves to the layout, perhaps approach the counter to ask where a particular item might be located. This man did none of those things. He walked directly to the electrical supplies aisle, moving with the confidence of someone who had either been in the store before or who had studied its layout in advance, and he began selecting items with unusual efficiency. Michael watched from behind the counter as the man picked up a spool of 22-gauge copper wire, examined it briefly, and placed it in a small wire shopping basket he'd taken from the stack near the door. He moved to the next section and selected a package of precision screwdrivers, the kind with interchangeable heads designed for working with small electronics or delicate mechanisms. Then he walked to the paint and chemicals section, where he spent approximately 3 minutes examining various bottles before selecting 3 specific containers, checking each label carefully before adding them to his basket. Michael recognized the chemicals: sodium thiosulfate, acetic acid, and hydroquinone, substances that were commonly purchased by amateur photographers for developing film, though it was unusual to see someone buying them separately rather than as part of a pre-mixed developer kit. The man continued through the store, consulting occasionally a small piece of paper he kept folded in his coat pocket, adding items to his basket with the methodical precision of someone working from a detailed list. Small mirrors, the kind typically used in automotive repair, a set of jeweler's loops, miniature spring mechanisms, a package of watch batteries, fine-tipped brushes. Each item, considered individually, was perfectly ordinary, the kind of merchandise the store sold dozens of every week to customers pursuing hobbies or making repairs. But something about the combination troubled Michael in a way he couldn't quite define. The man never hesitated, never second-guessed a selection, never asked for assistance or alternatives. He simply moved through the store, selected what he needed, and brought everything to the counter where Michael waited to ring up the purchase. The same man returned to Arlington Hardware on November 1st, 1977, approximately 2 weeks after his initial visit, arriving at roughly the same time in the afternoon, between 2 and 2:30. Michael was restocking shelves in the plumbing section when he noticed the customer enter, and he felt an immediate jolt of recognition. The man wore a different coat this time, a tan trench coat instead of the dark wool, but the wire-rimmed glasses, the rigid posture, and the purposeful stride were unmistakable. Michael watched as the customer moved directly to the hardware section without pausing to orient himself, picked up a basket, and began the same methodical selection process Michael had observed 2 weeks earlier. This time, the items were different, but equally specific. A small handheld drill with variable speed settings, a set of precision drill bits ranging from 1/32 inch to 1/8 inch in diameter, a package of miniature clamps, several sheets of fine grit sandpaper in varying grades, a tube of fast-drying epoxy adhesive, and once again, chemicals, this time including potassium ferricyanide and sodium carbonate, substances Michael recognized from his own brief experimentation with photography in high school as components used in certain specialized developing processes. When the man brought his items to the counter, Michael processed the transaction with professional efficiency while trying to observe as much as possible without appearing intrusive. The customer paid in cash, counting out exact bills from a leather wallet that looked expensive and well-maintained. His hands, Michael noticed, were soft and uncalloused, not the hands of someone who worked regularly with tools or performed manual labor. The man thanked Michael in a voice that carried the slightest trace of an accent, something Michael couldn't quite place but that seemed vaguely European, perhaps German or possibly Slavic. Then he left, walking to a dark sedan parked 3 spaces down from the store entrance, and drove away heading east on Wilson Boulevard. After the customer departed, Michael found himself unable to shake a growing sense of unease about the purchases. That evening, during a slow period before closing time, he pulled out a small notebook he kept in his back pocket for tracking inventory discrepancies and personal reminders, and he wrote down everything he could remember about both transactions. The date and approximate time of each visit, the items purchased, the customer's physical description, the make and model of the vehicle, a late-model Buick, dark blue or black, though Michael hadn't managed to note the license plate number. On November 15th, the customer returned for a 3rd time, and this visit differed from the previous 2 in a way that transformed Michael's vague unease into something approaching genuine concern. The man entered the store at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, later than his previous arrivals, and he was not alone. A second man accompanied him, younger by perhaps 10 years, shorter and stockier, with dark hair and a heavier build. The 2 men moved through the store together, and Michael positioned himself where he could observe them while pretending to organize a display of extension cords near the electrical aisle. The men spoke to each other in low voices, and though Michael couldn't hear most of their conversation, he caught fragments as they passed within a few feet of where he stood. The younger man was asking questions about specific items, pointing to products on the shelves and speaking in what Michael clearly recognized as accented English. the pronunciation deliberate and careful, in a way that suggested the language was learned rather than native. The older customer, the man Michael had seen twice before, responded in what sounded like the same language but with greater fluency, his tone carrying notes of irritation, as if the younger man's presence was unwelcome or represented a breach of some unspoken protocol. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the older man made his selections, this time purchasing optical equipment, a jeweler's loupe with high magnification, and several small mirrors of the type used in precision work, along with more wire and additional chemical compounds. The younger man purchased nothing and left the store first, walking quickly to a different vehicle parked across the street. The older customer completed his transaction with Michael, paid in cash as before, and departed without the usual brief pleasantries that had characterized his previous visits. Michael immediately wrote down everything he'd observed, noting the presence of the second man, the accented conversation, and the older customer's apparent discomfort with being accompanied. That weekend, Michael went to the Arlington Public Library and spent 3 hours in the reference section, consulting books on photography, chemistry, and technical processes. What he discovered made his earlier unease crystallize into something more concrete and more troubling. The chemicals the customer had purchased across 3 separate visits, when combined and used in specific proportions, matched precisely the formulas used for developing microfilm and processing photographic copies of documents, particularly the high-contrast photography used in intelligence work and document reproduction. The customer returned to Arlington Hardware on November 29, 1977, arriving at the store just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Michael was behind the counter processing a return for an elderly woman who had purchased the wrong size of furnace filter when he saw the man enter through the front door. This time, the customer moved with noticeably more haste than during his previous visits, walking quickly to the back section where optical and precision tools were displayed, selecting items with even less deliberation than before, barely pausing to examine anything before placing it in his basket. Michael finished helping the elderly woman and watched as the customer approached the counter carrying a small collection of items including more fine-gauge wire, additional miniature tools, and a handheld magnifying device with an attached light source. The man seemed distracted or possibly anxious, glancing toward the front window several times while Michael rang up each item and announced the running total. When Michael stated the final amount, the customer reached into the inside pocket of his coat to retrieve his wallet, and as he did so, a small photograph approximately 3 inches by 4 inches slipped from the pocket and fell onto the counter between them. Michael saw it clearly for perhaps 2 seconds before the customer's hand shot out and snatched it back, returning it quickly to his pocket with a motion that was both swift and defensive. But those 2 seconds were enough for Michael to register what the photograph showed. It was not a family portrait or a vacation snapshot or any kind of personal image. It appeared to be a photograph of a document, taken in low-light conditions that created high contrast between dark text and a lighter background. Michael could see rows of typed text, margins with what looked like official markings or stamps in the corners, and formatting that suggested some kind of technical report or official paperwork. The image quality was sharp despite the low light, the kind of clarity that required specialized equipment and careful technique to achieve. The customer completed the transaction without acknowledging what had happened, paid quickly in cash, took his bag, and left the store walking at a pace that bordered on rushing. Michael stood behind the counter for several minutes after the man departed, thinking about what he had just seen and weighing what it might mean. The photograph alone proved nothing conclusive, but combined with the pattern of purchases over the past 6 weeks, the specialized chemicals for document photography, the precision optical equipment, the secretive behavior, and now an actual photograph of what appeared to be an official document. The accumulation of evidence pointed toward something far more serious than innocent hobbyist photography or legitimate technical work. Michael spent the rest of that afternoon and evening wrestling with the question of whether he should report what he had observed to authorities, and if so, to whom. The concern that kept circling through his mind was the possibility of being wrong, of accusing someone of suspicious activity based on nothing more than purchases that might have perfectly innocent explanations, and a photograph he had glimpsed for only 2 seconds. What if the man worked for a government agency and was legitimately authorized to handle classified materials? What if the chemicals and equipment were for some specialized technical purpose Michael simply didn't understand? What if reporting his suspicions resulted in an innocent person being investigated, harassed, or having their life disrupted because a hardware store clerk had made unfounded assumptions? But the counterweight to those concerns was equally troubling. What if the man was engaged in espionage or document theft, and Michael's failure to report what he'd observed allowed that activity to continue? What if classified information was being photographed and passed to foreign intelligence services, and Michael had noticed the warning signs but chosen to do nothing? The responsibility of that possibility felt crushing, particularly given the geopolitical context of late 1977, with Cold War tensions between the United States and Soviet Union running high and Northern Virginia, serving as home to thousands of government employees, military personnel, and contractors with access to sensitive information. Michael decided to consult someone with more knowledge of government security procedures than he possessed. His sister's husband, David Chen, worked in an administrative capacity at the State Department, handling logistics and scheduling for mid-level officials. Michael called David that evening and asked if they could meet for coffee the following morning before David's shift began. They met at a diner in Rosslyn on November 30th, and Michael explained everything he had observed over the past 6 weeks, showing David the notes he had kept in his small notebook. David listened carefully, asked several clarifying questions about the specific chemicals and equipment purchased, and told Michael that while he couldn't say definitively whether the activity was illegal or suspicious, the pattern was concerning enough that it should be reported to the FBI field office in Alexandria. David wrote down a phone number on a napkin and told Michael that the Bureau had agents specifically assigned to handle reports of potential espionage or unauthorized handling of classified materials, and that they would be able to evaluate whether Michael's observations warranted further investigation. Michael made the call from a payphone outside the hardware store on the afternoon of December 1st, during his lunch break. The agent who answered took down basic information and then transferred Michael to Special Agent Warren Davies, who worked in the Counterintelligence Division. Michael described the pattern of purchases, the customer's behavior, the accented conversation with the second man, and finally, the dropped photograph. Davies asked detailed questions about the chemicals, requesting specific product names and chemical formulas where Michael could remember them. When Michael mentioned the combination of sodium thiosulfate, hydroquinone, potassium ferricyanide, and the optical equipment, Davies's tone shifted from polite interest to focused attention. He asked Michael if he could come to the FBI field office the following morning to provide a formal statement and bring any notes or records he had kept. Michael agreed, and an appointment was scheduled for 9 a.m. on December 2nd. Michael arrived at the FBI field office in Alexandria at 8:52 a.m. on December 2nd, 1977, carrying his small notebook and a manila folder containing receipts he had managed to locate in the store's filing system that corresponded to 2 of the customer's 3 purchases. The building was a nondescript 4-story structure on Eisenhower Avenue that could have housed any kind of federal administrative operation, and Michael waited in a lobby area with gray carpeting and institutional furniture until Special Agent Warren Davies appeared at approximately 9:05 to escort him to a conference room on the third floor. Davies was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with dark hair beginning to thin at the crown, and he wore a dark suit with a narrow tie that suggested both professionalism and a certain adherence to bureaucratic formality. The conference room was small and windowless, containing only a rectangular table, 4 chairs, and a tape recorder that Davies activated after asking Michael's permission to record the interview for documentation purposes. Over the next hour and 20 minutes, Michael walked Davies through everything he had observed, starting with the initial transaction on October 18th and progressing chronologically through each subsequent visit. Davies took extensive notes in a leather-bound notebook, occasionally stopping Michael to ask clarifying questions about specific items purchased, the customer's physical appearance, or particular details of behavior that Michael had noted. When Michael reached the part about the dropped photograph, Davies asked him to describe exactly what he had seen in as much detail as possible: the size of the image, the quality of the reproduction, whether any text had been legible, and whether he had noticed any identifying markings or classification stamps. Michael explained that he had seen the photograph for only approximately 2 seconds, and that while he couldn't read specific text, the format and appearance had suggested an official document of some kind, possibly technical or administrative in nature. After Michael finished his account, Davies excused himself and left the conference room for approximately 15 minutes, returning with the second agent, a woman in her mid-30s named Carol Hendricks, who specialized in technical analysis of espionage methods and equipment. Hendricks asked Michael to go through the list of chemicals and equipment purchases again, this time with her interrupting frequently to confirm specific product specifications, quantities, and brand names where Michael could remember them. When Michael finished the second recitation, Hendricks and Davies exchanged a look that Michael would later describe as significant, a moment of silent communication between professionals who had recognized something important. Davies informed Michael that the combination of materials he had described matched known procurement patterns associated with document photography operations, specifically the kind used for reproducing classified materials onto microfilm, or creating high-resolution copies that could be reduced in size for concealment and transport. Davies then shifted to questions about Michael himself, his background, his length of employment at Arlington Hardware, his reasons for keeping notes about the customer's purchases, and whether he had discussed his observations with anyone other than his brother-in-law. Michael answered honestly, explaining that he had developed an instinct over 3 years of working at the store for recognizing when something felt wrong about a transaction, and that the pattern of purchases had triggered that instinct strongly enough that he felt compelled to document it. Davies asked whether Michael would be willing to continue working his normal schedule at the hardware store and to contact the FBI immediately if the customer returned. Michael agreed without hesitation, and Davies provided him with a direct phone number where he could reach the field office at any hour. The FBI's background check on Michael Brennan, conducted over the following 3 days through December 5th, confirmed his basic reliability and absence of any criminal record, financial irregularities, or personal associations that would suggest ulterior motives for his report. Davies presented Michael's information to his supervisor, and a decision was made to initiate a limited surveillance operation at Arlington Hardware during the afternoon hours when the customer had previously appeared. The operation would be low profile, consisting of 2 agents rotating shifts inside the store, posing as customers browsing merchandise, and 1 agent stationed in an unmarked vehicle in the parking lot with a view of the store entrance and the surrounding area. The surveillance began on December 6th, with agents carrying small radios concealed in jacket pockets and briefcases, allowing them to communicate with each other and with a coordination center at the field office without drawing attention from genuine customers or store employees. For the first week of surveillance, December 6th through December 13th, the customer did not appear. The store maintained its normal traffic flow of contractors, homeowners, and repair workers, and the agents rotated through shifts that covered the hours from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., the window during which all 3 previous visits had occurred. Michael continued his regular duties behind the counter and in the aisles, stocking shelves, processing transactions, and answering customer questions, while remaining aware of the FBI presence, and feeling a persistent low-level anxiety about whether the customer would return or whether the investigation would simply fade away due to lack of further evidence. During the second week, December 14th through December 17th, the pattern continued with no sign of the customer, and Michael began to worry that his report had disrupted whatever operation had been underway, that the dropped photograph incident had spooked the man into abandoning his procurement methods or switching to a different supplier. On the afternoon of December 18th, 1977, at approximately 2:37 p.m., the customer walked through the front door of Arlington Hardware and Supply. Special Agent Robert Kim, positioned near the paint section pretending to compare prices on different brands of primer, immediately keyed his radio and transmitted a brief coded message that alerted the other agents inside the store and in the vehicle outside that the target had arrived. Michael was at the counter helping a customer select replacement parts for a broken door hinge when he saw the man enter, and he felt his pulse accelerate even as he maintained his outward composure and continued the transaction. The customer moved through the store with the same purposeful efficiency Michael had observed during previous visits, but this time there were subtle differences in his behavior that suggested heightened awareness or possible nervousness. He glanced toward the front windows more frequently, his eyes scanning the parking lot as if checking for surveillance. He moved more quickly between aisles, spending less time examining items before making selections. And when he brought his purchases to the counter, a collection that included precision optical lenses, additional chemical compounds, and fine metalworking tools, his hands trembled slightly as he counted out cash for payment. Michael processed the transaction with practiced efficiency while trying to appear completely normal, calling out each item's price and bagging the purchases in the standard brown paper bag Arlington Hardware used for small orders. The customer paid without making conversation beyond the minimal pleasantries required by the exchange, took his bag, and walked out of the store at a measured pace that seemed calculated to avoid drawing attention. Special Agent Kim waited exactly 45 seconds before following, walking casually to his vehicle and communicating via radio to the agent stationed in the unmarked sedan outside that mobile surveillance was initiating. The customer walked to his dark blue Buick parked 4 spaces from the store entrance, placed his purchases in the trunk, and drove out of the parking lot heading south on Wilson Boulevard toward Route 50. The FBI surveillance team, consisting of 3 vehicles rotating positions to avoid detection, followed the Buick through Arlington and into Falls Church, maintaining distances that varied between 3 and 8 car lengths depending on traffic conditions and visibility. The customer drove with apparent care, obeying speed limits, using turn signals, and making no sudden maneuvers that would suggest he was attempting to detect or evade followers. After approximately 25 minutes of driving through residential neighborhoods and commercial districts, the Buick turned into the parking lot of a garden-style apartment complex on Broad Street in Falls Church, a 2-story brick building constructed sometime in the 1960s with exterior staircases and numbered units visible from the parking area. The customer parked in a space marked for residents, retrieved his bag from the trunk, and walked to a ground-floor unit numbered 14, unlocking the door and entering without looking around or displaying any obvious counter-surveillance behavior. Special Agent Kim noted the address, 3847 Broad Street, Falls Church, Unit 14, and transmitted the information back to the field office while maintaining observation from a position approximately 150 yards away at the edge of an adjacent shopping center parking lot. The other surveillance vehicles broke off and departed the area to avoid creating a pattern of unfamiliar cars that might alert the customer or his neighbors to the presence of law enforcement. Kim remained in position for another 30 minutes, observing the apartment building and noting the license plate number of the Buick, Virginia registration THX4719, before leaving the area and returning to the field office to file his report. The vehicle registration, processed through Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles records on December 19th, came back registered to Thomas Andrew Reichman, born March 7, 1930, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Current address matching the Falls Church apartment. FBI database checks revealed that Reichman had become a naturalized United States citizen in 1962, having emigrated from West Germany in 1959, according to immigration records. His current employment, verified through tax records and business registrations, was listed as a technical translator for Meridian International Services, an import-export consulting firm with offices in downtown Washington that specialized in facilitating trade relationships between American companies and European businesses, particularly those in Germany, Austria, and Eastern European nations, including Poland and Czechoslovakia. Further investigation into Reichman's background over the following week revealed several inconsistencies that elevated the FBI's interest in the case. Employment records showed gaps between 1963 and 1965, and again between 1968 and 1970, periods for which Reichman had provided vague explanations in visa renewal applications about freelance translation work that could not be verified through tax returns or business records. Previous addresses listed in various documents didn't always match up chronologically, suggesting either clerical errors or deliberate obfuscation of his movements and residences. Associates interviewed as part of his naturalization process in 1962 included several individuals who themselves had come under FBI scrutiny in subsequent years for possible connections to Eastern European intelligence services, though none had ever been charged with crimes or definitively identified as foreign agents. On December 27, 1977, FBI agents obtained authorization through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to conduct financial surveillance on Reichman's bank accounts and to monitor his communications. The financial records, reviewed over a 3-day period between December 28th and December 30th, revealed patterns that suggested income beyond what his declared salary from Meridian International Services would support. Regular cash deposits ranging from $500 to $1,200 appeared in his checking account every 4 to 6 weeks. Deposits that were always made in person at branch locations rather than through direct deposit or mailed checks. The deposits had been occurring since at least 1974, based on the records the bank was able to provide, and they followed no consistent schedule but appeared frequently enough to suggest regular payments for services rendered. Additional surveillance conducted during the final week of December and into early January 1978 established Reichman's routine patterns of movement. He left his apartment most weekday mornings between 8:15 and 8:45, drove to the Meridian International offices on K Street in Washington, and typically remained there until late afternoon. Several evenings per week he stopped at various locations: a library in Arlington, a delicatessen in Georgetown, a bookstore near DuPont Circle, spending between 20 and 40 minutes at each location before returning home. The FBI noted that these stops followed no consistent pattern, and that Reichman appeared to be conducting counter-surveillance checks during his travels, occasionally making unexpected turns, pulling into parking lots, and waiting for several minutes before continuing, and using routes that would allow him to observe whether vehicles were following him. On January 12, 1978, Special Agent Davies met with Michael Brennan at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Arlington Hardware to update him on the investigation's progress and to request his continued cooperation. Davies explained, within the limits of what he was authorized to disclose, that the customer had been identified and was under active investigation, that the purchases Michael had documented appeared to be connected to possible espionage activities, and that federal prosecutors were building a case that would require substantial additional evidence before charges could be filed. Davies asked Michael whether he would be willing to testify before a grand jury if the case progressed to that stage, and Michael agreed without hesitation, stating that he wanted to see the matter through to whatever conclusion the evidence supported. On the morning of February 14, 1978, at approximately 6:15 a.m., a team of 8 FBI agents executed federal search and arrest warrants at Thomas Reichmann's apartment in Falls Church. The operation had been planned meticulously over the preceding 2 weeks, with agents briefed on the apartment's layout, potential exit points, and the specific evidence they were authorized to seize under the warrant's provisions. Reichmann was taken into custody as he answered the door, still wearing pajamas and a robe, and he was handcuffed and informed of his rights while agents began a systematic search of the premises. The apartment was modest, a 1-bedroom unit with a small kitchen, a living room furnished spartanly with a couch and bookshelf, and a bedroom that had been converted partially into a workspace with a desk positioned near the window. The search, documented in a 23-page inventory report filed later that day, uncovered substantial evidence supporting the espionage investigation. In a closet off the bedroom, concealed behind a false panel in the wall that agents discovered only after noticing inconsistencies in the closet's depth compared to the apartment's exterior measurements, was a compact darkroom setup including chemical trays, developing equipment, and a 35mm camera modified with specialized lenses for document photography. The camera was a Minox C, a model known for its use in intelligence operations due to its small size and high-resolution capabilities. Agents found 14 rolls of undeveloped film, stored in light-tight containers, along with approximately 200 strips of developed negatives showing photographs of technical documents, diagrams, and typed reports that appeared to contain classified or sensitive information related to defense systems, satellite reconnaissance capabilities, and communications protocols. In the desk drawer, agents recovered handwritten notes in German containing technical specifications and data that corresponded to materials Reichmann would have had access to through his translation work with clients holding defense contracts. A ledger found in the same drawer contained columns of numbers and dates that analysis would later reveal tracked payments received and documents delivered over a period extending back to at least 1975. Taped inside a kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator, in a location that would be difficult to access casually but easy to reach if one knew where to look, was an envelope containing $7,400 in cash, predominantly in $50 and $100 bills with sequential serial numbers suggesting they had come from the same source. Reichmann was transported to the FBI field office in Alexandria and placed in an interrogation room at 7:42 a.m. For the first several hours, he exercised his right to remain silent, sitting without speaking while agents came and went and requesting to speak with an attorney. A federal public defender arrived at approximately 11:30 a.m., and after conferring with Reichmann privately for nearly an hour, informed agents that his client was prepared to make a limited statement. The interrogation that followed, conducted by Special Agent Davies and documented in transcript form, revealed that Reichmann acknowledged photographing documents he accessed through his work as a translator, claiming he had been approached in 1974 by a man he knew only as Victor, who had offered him substantial payments in exchange for copies of technical materials related to American defense and intelligence capabilities. Reichman described Victor as being in his early 50s, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, and a slight accent that Reichman believed was Russian, though Victor had claimed to be Czech. Their meetings had always occurred in public locations, restaurants, parks, shopping centers, and communication between meetings was handled through a signaling system involving chalk marks on utility poles and advertisements placed in the classified section of the Washington Post using specific phrases as codes. Reichman insisted that he had been coerced into cooperation after Victor threatened to expose irregularities in his immigration paperwork and suggested that his naturalization could be revoked, leaving him stateless. He claimed that the hardware store purchases documented by Michael Brennan had been made at Victor's instruction to maintain and upgrade his document photography equipment, and that he had been unaware the store clerk had been observing and recording his transactions. When asked about the younger man who had accompanied him to Arlington Hardware on November 15th, Reichman stated that Victor had sent an associate to check on him after Reichman had expressed reluctance to continue the arrangement, and that the associate's presence had been meant as intimidation rather than assistance. Reichman claimed he did not know the associate's name or how to contact him. Regarding Victor himself, Reichman provided a physical description and details about their meeting locations, but insisted that Victor had never revealed his real name, home address, or any information that could be used to identify or locate him. FBI agents cross-referenced Reichman's description of Victor with their database of known and suspected Soviet intelligence operatives, but found no definitive matches that could be pursued with sufficient confidence to justify arrests or further investigation. The investigation into Victor continued for several months, with agents monitoring locations where Reichman claimed meetings had occurred and analyzing the signaling systems he had described. But Victor never appeared and made no apparent attempt to re-establish contact with Reichman or to reactivate communication protocols. The FBI's assessment, documented in reports filed throughout the spring of 1978, concluded that Victor had likely been operating under deep cover with carefully constructed false identity documents, and that he had either left the country shortly after the November 15th hardware store visit or had gone dormant, suspending all intelligence activities to avoid detection. Thomas Reichman was formally charged on March 3, 1978, with multiple counts under Title 18 of the United States Code, including unauthorized possession and transmission of information relating to national defense, acting as an agent of a foreign government without notification to the Attorney General, and conspiracy to commit espionage. After negotiations between his attorney and federal prosecutors that extended through the spring, Reichman pleaded guilty on May 18, 1978, to reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation with ongoing counterintelligence efforts and his agreement to provide detailed debriefings about his contacts with Victor and the methods used in their operation. On June 23, 1978, Reichman appeared before a federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia for sentencing. The judge, after hearing arguments from both prosecution and defense, and reviewing classified damage assessments regarding the materials Reichman had photographed and transmitted, has sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison, noting that his cooperation had been useful, but had ultimately failed to result in the identification or capture of his foreign handler. Reichman would serve 8 years of the sentence before being released on parole in November 1986. Michael Brennan received a formal letter of commendation from the FBI in July 1978, thanking him for his vigilance and cooperation in an investigation that had resulted in the disruption of an active espionage operation. The letter, signed by the special agent in charge of the Washington field office, noted that his attention to detail and willingness to report suspicious activity had contributed materially to protecting national security, though the specific details of the case remained classified and could not be publicly disclosed. The owner of Arlington Hardware never learned the full story behind Michael's involvement with federal investigators, knowing only that Michael had assisted authorities with some unspecified matter that required him to take occasional time away from work for meetings. Michael continued working at the hardware store for another 6 years, before taking a position with a larger home improvement retailer in 1984. The store on Wilson Boulevard remained in operation until 1996, when it was sold and the building converted into office space. Michael Brennan, when asked years later about the incident, would say that he had simply noticed something that didn't seem right, and had done what any responsible citizen should do when faced with evidence of potential wrongdoing, that he had reported it to the proper authorities and let them handle the investigation. The fact that his observations during routine workdays at a neighborhood hardware store had helped dismantle an intelligence operation that had been running successfully for years remained something he rarely discussed. Understanding that most espionage cases end not with dramatic confrontations but with careful documentation, patient surveillance, and ordinary people paying attention to details that others might overlook.